The hospital cafeteria always smelled faintly of bleach and overcooked potatoes, but today, as I shuffled past the rows of tables, there was an odd undercurrent, a metallic tang in the air. It clung to my skin, almost like a memory I couldn't shake. I grabbed a tray of watery soup and sat near the far corner, away from the nurses' knowing stares and the muffled conversations of other patients. It was then I saw it. An old, leather-bound book sitting half-hidden beneath a stack of napkins by the condiment station. I don't know why I noticed it or why my chest tightened as I walked toward it, but I couldn't look away. The cover was worn and cracked, like something out of an antique shop, and when I opened it, I realized it wasn't a book at all. It was a visitor log. Pages upon pages of looping signatures greeted me, all carefully dated. Some names I recognized, family members visiting patients, local priests offering solace. But most were unfamiliar. I flipped through the pages, absently scanning the entries. The handwriting changed with each new visitor. Some scrawled hurriedly, others wrote with careful precision. And then I saw it. My name, Max Whitaker, January 17, 2003. The air around me seemed to thicken. My knees buckled slightly, forcing me to grip the edge of the counter for support. The ink was unmistakable. My handwriting, down to the slight slant and the looping K I'd always been teased for in school. But that was impossible. 20 years ago, I would have been a child, barely old enough to hold a pen properly, let alone visit a mental hospital. My stomach churned as I stared at the entry, willing it to vanish, to make sense, to not be there. It wasn't. I glanced around the cafeteria, searching for a pair of amused eyes or a smirking face. Some sign this was a prank. But everyone was occupied with their own lives, their own meals, their own mutterings to unseen entities. I slammed the log shut and stuffed it under my tray, my pulse hammering as I returned to my seat. The soup sat untouched. Find something interesting? The voice startled me. It was a nurse, Deborah, I think her name was, standing just behind me, her face carefully neutral. Her eyes flicked to the log under my tray, but she didn't press further. I shook my head, muttering something about old records. She gave a curt nod and left, but the weight of her gaze lingered long after she was gone. That night I couldn't sleep. The fluorescent light from the hallway filtered under the door, flickering faintly. I lay on my cot, the log propped open on my knees, scanning every line, every name, every date for more clues. But there was nothing else. No more entries that bore my handwriting, no cryptic messages scrawled in the margins. Just my name, my handwriting, dated 20 years ago. It was long past midnight when the dreams began. Sleep came grudgingly, dragging me down like quicksand. The thin mattress and the scratchy blanket on my cot weren't exactly conducive to rest, but the weight of exhaustion finally overpowered my racing thoughts. When the dream began, it didn't feel like a dream at all. I was standing in a hallway, not the hospital's hallway, though it shared the same sterile, institutional vibe. The walls were a washed-out yellow, the kind you might see in a decades-old elementary school, and the floor was tiled in a pattern that shifted subtly, like it was alive and watching me. The air was heavy, thick with something that smelled faintly of mildew and decay. I didn't know why, but I felt compelled to walk forward. My bare feet slapped softly against the cold floor as I moved, each step echoing endlessly, stretching out into the void. That's when I saw them. A cluster of people standing at the far end of the hall, their faces turned away from me. I couldn't make out their features, just outlines. Their clothing seemed wrong somehow, outdated, like they'd stepped out of an old black and white photograph. "Max," one of them called, a woman's voice, thin and brittle like dried leaves. It was distant, yet impossibly close, whispering directly into my ear. I froze. My name. My name. How did she know my name? My chest felt tight, my lungs straining for air. Against all logic, against every screaming instinct, I took another step toward them. They turned. My breath hitched. Their faces, God, their faces. They were all wrong, distorted, stretched as though someone had grabbed the edges and tugged mercilessly. Their mouths were too wide, their eyes too small, their skin too pale and shiny, like wax figures left too close to a flame. And yet, in those grotesque features, there was something familiar. A man in the middle, his face melting like candle wax, raised a hand. "Max," he said, his voice thick and syrupy. "Do you remember us?" I couldn't speak, couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the floor. "We remember you," the woman said, her face twisting into what might have been a smile. "It's been so long since you visited. You promised you'd come back." Promised? No, I didn't know them. I didn't remember them. But something deep inside me whispered that they were telling the truth. "Who?" My voice cracked. "Who are you?" The man tilted his head, his neck bending at an unnatural angle. "We're the forgotten," he said, his words slithering into my ears. "But you're not. Not yet." I staggered back, my heart pounding like a war drum. Their smiles grew wider, too wide, splitting their faces in half. And then the walls began to bleed. Dark, viscous liquid seeped from every crack, running in rivulets down the yellowed paint, pooling at my feet. The smell was overwhelming, metallic and choking, like a slaughterhouse. "You can't leave us again," the woman hissed, her voice splitting into echoes. The floor beneath me cracked, and I fell. I woke up screaming, my throat raw, my sheets drenched in sweat. The fluorescent light outside my door flickered erratically, and for a moment, I could have sworn I heard someone whisper my name in the hallway. But when I pressed my ear to the door, there was only silence. Only the silence, and the faint smell of blood. The next morning, the dream lingered like a bruise on my mind, tender to the touch. I couldn't shake the image of those faces, stretched and waxy, or the feeling of that viscous liquid pooling at my feet. The taste of metal still clung to the back of my throat. I tried to push it aside, to write it off as a hallucination, a product of stress, or maybe the medication Dr. Lewis had started me on last week. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just a dream. It felt too real, too vivid, like a memory clawing its way to the surface. The visitor log was still tucked under my mattress. I didn't dare open it again, not yet. Not with the weight of those voices still pressing on my chest. Instead, I went to the cafeteria, forcing down watery oatmeal and bitter coffee while the other patients muttered and shuffled around me. Their voices blended into a low hum, a background static that set my teeth on edge. The hospital was always unsettling in the daylight, with its endless beige walls and buzzing fluorescent lights. But today, something was different. The air felt thicker, heavier. Every step I took echoed louder than it should have, the sound bouncing off walls that seemed just a little too close. And the walls themselves, they didn't look right. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but as I walked back toward my room, I realized they were subtly shifting. Not moving in an obvious way, but bending, curving in ways that made no sense. It was like the building was breathing, the corridors narrowing and widening with each inhalation. I stopped in the middle of the hallway, staring at the faint ripple in the wallpaper. It moved again, just slightly, like a snake slithering beneath the surface. My stomach churned. "You okay there, Max?" I jumped, whipping around to see a nurse. Deborah again, her face twisted in that same neutral mask she always wore. She was holding a clipboard, her eyes narrowing as she studied me. "Yeah," I said, my voice rasping. "Just tired. Didn't sleep well." She nodded, not unkindly. "You've been through a lot. It's normal to feel disoriented sometimes. These walls can play tricks on you, you know?" That last sentence sent a chill down my spine. Did she mean it literally? Or was she just humoring me? Another unstable patient, lost in his own delusions? "I'll be fine," I muttered, brushing past her. Her gaze lingered on me, heavy and questioning. As I walked away, the rest of the day passed in a blur of unease. I avoided the other patients, avoided the staff, avoided the cafeteria. Every time I passed a door or window, I could have sworn I saw movement in the corner of my eye. Shadows slipping just out of view, shapes that didn't belong. By the time night fell, my nerves were raw, and the thought of sleeping again filled me with dread. But exhaustion won out, as it always did, dragging me back into its suffocating embrace. This time, the dream began in the hospital. I was standing in my own room, but it wasn't quite right. The bed was wrong, the sheets too clean. The walls were pristine, unmarked by the scratches and scuffs I'd come to know. And the air, it was stifling, thick with a heat that pressed against my skin like a damp towel. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a darkened hallway. No lights, no sound, just an endless black void. My feet moved before I could think, carrying me into the darkness. The hallway stretched on forever, twisting and turning in impossible ways. Doors lined the walls, each one slightly ajar, and behind each door, I could hear faint whispers, laughter, sobs, screams. At one door, I paused, my hand trembling as I pushed it open. Inside was a small room, empty except for a mirror on the far wall. The mirror's surface shimmered like water, rippling gently. I stepped closer, my reflection growing clearer. And then it moved independently of me. The figure in the mirror smiled, its teeth too sharp, its eyes too bright. "You don't belong here," it said in my voice. "You never did." I stumbled back, and the door slammed shut behind me. The whispers in the hallway grew louder, rising to a cacophony. I turned, desperate to run, but the corridor was gone. The walls had closed in, pressing against my shoulders, suffocating me. And then I woke up, gasping for air, the sound of my name still echoing in my ears. Outside my door, footsteps shuffled away, soft, deliberate, far too slow to belong to any nurse. The following morning, I couldn't stop shaking. I sat on the edge of my cot, staring at the visitor log I'd pulled from beneath the mattress. The worn leather cover seemed to pulse in my hands, like something alive. I flipped to the page with my name again, the ink still glaringly fresh, as though I'd just written it. Dated 20 years ago. I slammed it shut, shoving it back under the mattress, but the thought burrowed deep into my mind. The whispers from the dreams, "You don't belong here, you never did," echoed in my ears, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was watching me. I needed answers. The hospital felt wrong today, wrong in ways that went beyond the usual stale air and buzzing fluorescence. The walls seemed to hum faintly, a low vibration that I could feel in my teeth. Shadows lingered too long at the edges of my vision, darting out of sight when I turned my head. Every face I passed, a nurse, a patient, a janitor, looked off, their features blurred together, like they'd been sculpted hastily and with little care. And their eyes, God, their eyes, hollow, flat, as though whatever spark made them human had been plucked out. The cafeteria was nearly empty when I arrived, a few patients mumbling to themselves at scattered tables. I sat down with my tray, my appetite non-existent. My eyes kept drifting to the corner where I'd found the log, half expecting it to still be there, half expecting it to move. "Max!" A voice hissed. I jolted, my head snapping up. The voice had been close, almost intimate, like someone whispering directly into my ear. But the room was silent, the patients oblivious, lost in their own fogs. Then I heard it again. "Max." This time it came from the wall. I stood, my legs shaky as I moved closer to the source of the sound. The tiles near the corner where the log had been were old and cracked, the grout darkened with age. I pressed my ear to the cold surface, my breath shallow. The voice came again, faint but unmistakable. "Max, come back." I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The whispers rose, layering over one another, unintelligible and urgent, like 1,000 voices all speaking at once. The walls themselves seemed to tremble, the cracks in the tiles widening, blackness oozing out like ink. "Max." One voice rose above the rest, deep and resonant, freezing me in place. "You've been here before. Don't you remember?" I turned and ran, ignoring the stares of the patients as I bolted from the cafeteria. My feet carried me blindly down the hallways, past nurses and staff who didn't try to stop me. The walls twisted around me, the corridors shifting, leading me somewhere I didn't want to go. And then I was there. It was a small, locked room, one I'd never noticed before, though I must have passed it 100 times. The door was heavy, reinforced with a rusted steel plate. My hand moved to the doorknob before I could think, the cold metal biting into my palm. "Max." The voices whispered again, louder this time, coming from all around me. "Come inside." The doorknob turned easily, and the door creaked open. The room beyond was small and dark, lit only by a single, flickering bulb. And in the center there was a chair bolted to the floor, with leather straps hanging limply from its arms. My blood turned to ice. I recognized the chair. I didn't know how, but I did. Images flashed in my mind. Hands restraining me, needles piercing my skin, muffled screams that might have been my own. "You don't belong here," the voices said again, this time louder, almost mocking. "But you'll never leave." I slammed the door shut and stumbled back, my breath ragged. When I turned to flee, I saw the faint outline of someone standing at the end of the hallway, a shadow too tall and too still to be human. And then it began to move toward me. My legs felt like lead, but instinct took over. I turned and bolted down the hallway, the sound of my footsteps echoing like gunshots in the sterile emptiness. Behind me, the shadow moved, gliding soundlessly over the floor. It didn't walk. It flowed, its edges shifting and undulating like smoke caught in a draft. I didn't dare look back again. The hallways twisted around me, the once familiar paths rearranging themselves into a labyrinth. Left, right, another left. Every turn felt like it led me deeper into some unseen trap. The air grew heavier, thicker, and I could hear faint whispers brushing against the edges of my consciousness. They were close now, unbearably close. "Max," the voices crooned, their tones syrupy and sickly sweet. "You can't run forever." A door loomed ahead, slightly ajar. I shoved through it without thinking, slamming it shut behind me. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my back pressed against the cold metal. For a moment there was silence. Then the knob began to rattle. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my own ragged breathing. "No, no, no." The rattle stopped, replaced by a long, low creak. I realized, too late, that the door was bending inward, the steel groaning as though it were made of rubber. The shadow seeped through the cracks, pooling on the floor before rising again, its form coalescing into something vaguely human. The room I'd barged into was small, bare except for a desk pushed against one wall and a lone chair in the corner. There were no windows, no other doors, just me and the thing that now loomed in front of me, its featureless face somehow staring directly into mine. "Max," it said, its voice a hollow echo of my own. Couldn't move, couldn't speak. My body was frozen, every muscle locked in place by some unseen force. The shadow tilted its head, studying me with an almost childlike curiosity. "You don't remember," it whispered, and this time the voice wasn't mine. It was layered, overlapping, male, female, young, old. A chorus of voices that made my skull feel like it was splitting apart. "Remember what?" I finally croaked, the words scraping against my dry throat. It didn't answer. Instead, it raised one elongated arm, its fingers stretching impossibly long, and pointed at the desk. My eyes followed the gesture reluctantly, landing on a single object resting atop the desk surface. A photograph. I didn't want to pick it up. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to leave it, to turn and run and never look back. But my hand moved anyway, trembling as it reached for the photo. The image was faded, black and white, and though the faces were blurred, I could still make them out. A young boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old, with a wide, toothy grin. Behind him stood a man and a woman, their expressions blank, almost lifeless. The boy was holding something in his hands, an old, leather-bound book, the visitor log. The realization hit me like a sledgehammer. That boy, it was me. The shape of the grin, the slight slant of the eyes, it was unmistakable. My stomach twisted into knots, bile rising in my throat. "This isn't possible," I whispered, my voice cracking. This can't be real." The shadow laughed, a sound like dry leaves scraping against concrete. "You've always been here, Max. You are here." I looked up, but the shadow was gone. The room was empty, silent, the door behind me perfectly intact. The photograph trembled in my hands, and when I looked down again, the faces had changed. The boy was still smiling, but his eyes were hollow, black voids. The man and woman behind him were no longer lifeless. They were screaming, their mouths open wide in silent agony. And in the boy's hand, the visitor log was open, the pages filled with nothing but my name, written over and over again. I dropped the photo and stumbled back, my legs giving out beneath me. As I hit the floor, the room seemed to ripple, the walls bending inward like they were breathing. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping and chaotic. "You'll never leave, Max. Never." The door burst open and I screamed. But when I looked up, it wasn't the shadow standing there. It was Nurse Deborah, her face pale and tight with concern. "Max?" she asked, stepping cautiously into the room. "What are you doing in here? This area is off limits." I couldn't answer, couldn't even breathe. And then I noticed something in her hand. A photograph, identical to the one I just dropped. Nurse Deborah stood in the doorway, holding the photograph like it was the most natural thing in the world. Her brow was furrowed, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Max, what is this?" she asked, shaking the photo slightly, as if to snap me out of whatever trance I seemed to be in. I wanted to speak, to explain, but my voice was caught somewhere between my lungs and my throat. My gaze darted to the floor where I'd dropped the picture. It was gone. My heart hammered in my chest as I slowly turned back to Deborah. The photo in her hand, it wasn't the same. This one showed a single figure, a man. He was seated in the very chair that had been bolted to the floor in the room I'd opened earlier, his head tilted forward, hiding his face. His arms hung loosely by his sides, and the leather straps were tightly secured around his wrists and ankles. I finally managed to rasp. "I don't know. I found it here." Deborah's expression didn't change. She took a step closer, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Max, this is serious. This area is restricted. No one is supposed to be here." "I didn't mean to," I started, but stopped when I noticed her hand trembling. Her grip on the photograph tightened, her knuckles whitening. Her face was blank, but her eyes betrayed something else entirely. Fear. "Where did you find this?" she asked again, her voice low and steady, but I could hear the tension in it. "On the desk," I said, gesturing weakly toward the room behind me. But when I turned to look, the desk was empty. No photo, no evidence of what I'd seen. My stomach dropped. "You need to come with me," she said abruptly, her voice clipped. She grabbed my arm, her fingers cold and firm, and began leading me out of the room. I didn't resist. My body felt like it was running on autopilot, too dazed and terrified to protest. The hallway outside felt even more suffocating than before. The buzzing of the overhead lights was deafening, a steady, grating whine that burrowed into my skull. Deborah said nothing as she led me down twisting corridors that seemed unfamiliar, though I knew I'd walked them before. The hospital felt different now, alive, pulsating with a slow, rhythmic energy that made my skin crawl. Finally, we stopped in front of an unmarked door. Deborah glanced at me, her lips pressing into a grim line before she knocked twice. The sound echoed unnaturally, far louder than it should have been. The door opened, revealing Dr. Lewis. His face was calm, unreadable, but his eyes held something I couldn't place. Recognition, curiosity, fear. "Max," he said softly, stepping aside to let us in. "Please have a seat." The room was small, sparsely furnished with just a desk and 2 chairs. It was unervingly clean, the walls an unbroken stretch of pale gray. Deborah stayed near the door, clutching the photograph tightly, as if it might fly away if she loosened her grip. Dr. Lewis sat across from me, folding his hands neatly on the desk. His gaze was piercing, unrelenting. "Deborah says you found something," he began, his tone measured. "A photograph?" I nodded slowly, my throat dry. "I don't know what it is. I found it in a room, one I've never seen before." "Describe the room," he said, his voice steady. "It was small, dark. There was a chair in the center, bolted to the floor. It felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there." Dr. Lewis's expression didn't change, but I noticed a flicker of something in his eyes. Recognition, maybe. He leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping a steady rhythm on the desk. "And the photograph? What was in it?" I hesitated, glancing at Deborah. She was staring at me intently, her grip on the photo tightening. "It was me," I said finally. "A boy holding a book. The visitor log." And then it changed. The faces. My voice broke, the memory flooding back in vivid detail. The faces were screaming. Dr. Lewis nodded slowly, as if I just confirmed something he already suspected. He turned to Deborah and held out his hand. She hesitated for a moment, then reluctantly handed him the photograph. He studied it in silence, his expression unreadable. Finally, he set it down on the desk, pushing it toward me. "Max," he said quietly, "this isn't what you described." I stared at the photo, my heart pounding. It wasn't the boy or the visitor log. It wasn't the chair. It was the shadow, its form stretched and distorted, its edges bleeding into the background. And its face, if you could call it that, was staring directly at me, empty and featureless. "What is this?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Dr. Lewis didn't answer. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. "Max, I need you to tell me the truth. Do you remember why you're here?" The question hit me like a physical blow. My mind raced, fragments of memories and dreams colliding in a chaotic blur. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came, because deep down I didn't know. I didn't know anything. Dr. Lewis's question hung in the air, suffocating me. The sterile room, the dull hum of the lights, the tension radiating from Nurse Deborah. It all felt like a trap. My mind churned, clawing for answers, but every memory felt slippery, like water through my fingers. I don't know," I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't remember." Dr. Lewis's face remained unreadable, his fingers steepled in front of him. He exchanged a glance with Deborah, who shifted uncomfortably by the door. "It's not unusual," he said finally, his voice calm but tinged with something darker. "Many patients here struggle with memory lapses, especially those with your history." "My history?" I shot back, panic creeping into my voice. "What do you mean by that?" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "You've been a patient here before, Max, but it was a long time ago, 20 years to be exact." The room tilted, my stomach lurching violently. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "That's impossible. I've never been here before. I'm here for..." I trailed off, realizing I couldn't finish the sentence. Why was I here? Dr. Lewis leaned forward, his voice low and measured. "You were admitted as a child, Max. You spent several months here after a traumatic event." "What traumatic event?" My voice cracked, the words spilling out in a rush. What happened to me? His eyes softened, but the weight behind them made my skin crawl. You were found wandering the grounds of the hospital, alone. No one could explain how you got here or why. You didn't speak for weeks. When you finally did, he paused, glancing at Deborah again. You claimed you'd seen things, people who weren't there, places that didn't exist. The words hit me like a freight train, memories stirring just out of reach. Flashes of shadowy figures, shifting walls, a deep, resonant voice calling my name. My chest tightened, the air in the room suddenly too thick to breathe. I don't remember any of that, I said, my voice trembling. Why don't I remember? Dr. Lewis folded his hands, his expression somber. Your memory was fragmented when you were discharged. It's not uncommon with cases of extreme psychological distress. But something brought you back here, Max, something you've buried. My hands gripped the edge of the desk, my knuckles white. The visitor log, I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. My name, it's in there, from 20 years ago, in my handwriting. Dr. Lewis's face didn't change, but I saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes. He knew. The log isn't meant to be accessed by patients, he said carefully. It's historical, a record of visitors over the years. But if your name is in it, it is, I snapped, the panic rising in my chest. Explain that. Explain how my name is there from 20 years ago when I didn't write it. Maybe you did, he said softly, his voice infuriatingly calm. Maybe you don't remember. The room felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing against my shoulders. My pulse thundered in my ears. You're lying, I spat. You're hiding something. All of you are. Dr. Lewis leaned back in his chair, studying me intently. Max, he said quietly, what do you think we're hiding? The question stunned me. I didn't have an answer, not a coherent one, anyway. All I knew was the dread pooling in my gut, the sense that nothing about this place was real. Not the nurses, not the walls, not even the memories they claimed were mine. The photograph on the desk caught my eye again, and my blood ran cold. The shadow in the image had shifted. It was closer now, its form more defined, and its featureless face seemed to be staring directly at me. I shoved back from the desk, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. I need to go, I said, my voice trembling. I can't stay here. Deborah stepped forward, her hand outstretched as if to calm me. Max, please. No, I snapped, backing toward the door. You're lying to me, all of you, and I'm going to find out the truth. Without waiting for a response, I bolted from the room, the door slamming shut behind me. The hallways felt even more distorted than before. The walls seemed to pulse faintly, like a heartbeat, and the lights flickered erratically. Every shadow seemed alive, slithering just out of sight. I had no destination in mind, just the overwhelming need to escape. I turned a corner and froze. At the end of the hallway, a figure stood, its form tall and impossibly thin. It was silhouetted against the flickering lights, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. My heart pounded as it began to move, gliding toward me soundlessly. Max, it whispered, the voice echoing in my mind. You'll never leave. I stumbled back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The hallway behind me stretched impossibly long, the walls curving inward like a tunnel. The figure kept coming, its movements slow but deliberate. And then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound, like a heartbeat. It wasn't coming from me. It was coming from the walls. The rhythmic pounding of the heartbeat grew louder with each passing second, vibrating through the floor and into my chest. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting as if the entire building were alive. My back pressed against the cold surface, the faint pulse tingling against my skin. The shadowed figure at the end of the hallway tilted its head, its motions unnervingly slow. Max, it whispered again, the sound slithering through the air like smoke. Come back to where you belong. I didn't think, I just ran. My feet pounded against the tiled floor, the lights above flickering erratically. The hallway twisted and shifted around me, bending in ways that defied logic. Doors appeared where I knew none had been before, only to vanish when I got closer. My lungs burned. My legs screamed in protest, but I couldn't stop. Behind me, the shadow glided closer. Its movements were smooth, fluid, unbothered by my frantic pace. The sound of its voice filled the air, a cacophony of whispers overlapping and echoing. You've been here before. You'll be here again. I rounded a corner and stumbled into a dead end. The hallway terminated in a featureless wall, its surface shimmering faintly, as if it were breathing along with the rest of the building. My hands slammed against it, searching for some hidden door or escape, but there was nothing. Just the relentless pulse beneath my fingertips, growing faster and louder. Please, I whispered, my voice cracking. Let me out. The air behind me grew colder. I turned slowly, dread pooling in my stomach. The shadow stood mere feet away, its form taller now, more defined. Its face, or lack thereof, was smooth and featureless, but I could feel its gaze boring into me. The edges of its body flickered and wavered, as though it were struggling to maintain its shape. Max, it said, its voice deep and resonant now, filling the hallway like a physical force. You can't run from yourself. What are you? I choked out, pressing my back against the wall. I am the truth, it replied, stepping closer. The truth you buried, the truth you forgot. But the walls remember. The hospital remembers. Its hand extended toward me, long and thin, its fingers stretching unnaturally. It's time to remember, Max. The wall behind me gave way suddenly, and I fell backward into darkness. Cold air rushed past me, and for a moment, I was weightless, tumbling through the void. The rhythmic pounding of the heartbeat followed me, growing faster and faster until it became deafening. When I landed, it wasn't on solid ground. The surface beneath me was soft and yielding, and the faint smell of copper filled the air. I scrambled to my feet, my hands brushing against something wet and sticky. A low light flickered overhead, illuminating my surroundings. I was in a vast, circular chamber, its walls slick with a dark, glistening substance that pulsed in time with the heartbeat. Veins of black and red ran along the walls, converging in the center where a massive, grotesque structure loomed. A tangled mass of flesh and metal, wires and tendrils weaving in and out of each other like the roots of a tree. And at its base, strapped to a chair bolted to the floor, was a figure. It was me. My double's head hung low, their face hidden beneath a mop of hair that looked exactly like mine. Their arms were bound to the chair by thick, leather straps, and their chest rose and fell with shallow, ragged breaths. I stepped closer, my legs trembling, until I was standing directly in front of them. Who are you? I whispered, though I already knew the answer. The figure's head lifted slowly, their face identical to mine but pale and sunken, as though they hadn't seen sunlight in years. Their eyes met mine, and I felt the air leave my lungs. I'm you, they said, their voice hoarse. The part of you they left behind. What does that mean? I demanded, my voice rising. What the hell is going on? You came here before, they said, their gaze unwavering. They took something from you, piece of your soul, your memory, your past. They buried it in these walls, but the hospital, it doesn't let anything go. The heartbeat quickened, the walls seeming to close in. Why don't I remember any of this? Because you weren't supposed to, they replied, their tone bitter. They made you forget, but I didn't. I've been here waiting for you to come back, and now you have. Their eyes flicked to the grotesque structure in the center of the room. But it's not done with us yet. Before I could respond, the shadow appeared again, rising from the floor like smoke. It loomed over both of us, its form towering and fluid, shifting in and out of focus. You can't leave, it said, its voice resonating through the chamber. Not until you remember. Not until you finish what you started. The shadow extended a hand toward the structure, and the veins on the walls pulsed violently. The room trembled, the air filled with a deafening roar. My double looked up at me, their eyes filled with a strange mix of fear and determination. You have to destroy it, they said, their voice urgent. That's the only way to end this. The shadow laughed, a deep, guttural sound that shook the ground beneath me. You'll never leave, Max. You're a part of this place. Forever. I turned to the structure, my heart pounding in time with the walls. The tendrils seemed to writhe, reaching for me, pulling me closer. The truth was buried here, in this pulsing, living nightmare, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know what it was. The grotesque structure loomed before me, its writhing tendrils glistening with the dark, pulsing substance that seeped from the walls. The air was thick, suffocating, and each breath I took burned my lungs like fire. The shadow towered behind me, its featureless face somehow radiating amusement. You're close now, it said, its voice resonating like a thunderclap. Closer than you've ever been. I glanced back at my double, still strapped to the chair. Their eyes met mine, hollow but pleading. You have to destroy it, they said again, their voice urgent. If you don't, you'll never leave. None of us will. The structure pulsed violently, and I stumbled back as one of its tendrils lashed out, brushing against my arm. The touch was cold, almost mechanical, but it sent a jolt through me, like a shock of memory I couldn't quite grasp. I don't understand, I whispered, my voice trembling. What is this? What am I supposed to do? The shadow moved closer, its form flickering and shifting. This is the heart of the hospital, it said almost reverently. Everything that has ever been forgotten, erased, or buried lives here, including you. The words hit me like a blow, and for a moment, the memories came rushing back. I was 7 years old, standing in the middle of a hallway that stretched on forever. The walls were pristine then, unmarked by the pulsing veins and dark fluid that now coated them. A nurse held my hand, her grip firm but not unkind. You're going to help us, Max, she said, her voice calm and soothing. You're special. I didn't understand what she meant. All I knew was that I was scared, the kind of deep, bone-chilling fear that only a child can feel. The hallway led to a room I didn't want to enter, though I didn't know why. Inside was the chair. It looked normal then, unassuming. They strapped me in gently, murmuring words of comfort as they placed wires against my temples and a strange device over my chest. I remembered crying, begging to go home, and then nothing, a void, like someone had taken a knife to my mind and carved out the memory, leaving only jagged edges where the truth should have been. I snapped back to the present, my knees buckling as the weight of the memory settled over me. My double's voice cut through the haze. You were part of an experiment, they said, their tone bitter. A way to harness memory, trauma, identity. They used us, Max. They used you. The tendrils of the structure lashed out again, one of them wrapping around my ankle. I gasped, trying to pull free, but its grip was like steel. Images flashed in my mind. Patients screaming, shadows writhing, doctors scribbling notes as the chair hummed with energy. The shadow laughed again, its form looming over me. You were the key, it said, the first to survive the process. But they didn't anticipate what would happen when the hospital remembered you. What do you mean? I shouted, struggling against the tendril's grip. You became part of it, the shadow said, its voice almost gleeful. Your memories, your pain, they fed the heart, and now it won't let you go. I looked back at the structure, the grotesque mass pulsating in time with the hospital's heartbeat. The truth was there, buried deep within the writhing tendrils and dark veins. If I destroyed it, would I be free? Or would I destroy myself along with it? My double's voice rose above the chaos. It's not just about you, Max. Everyone they've taken, everyone they've erased, they're all trapped here. You have to end it. The tendril around my ankle tightened, dragging me closer to the structure. The air grew colder, the whispers louder, and the shadow leaned in, its featureless face inches from mine. Choose, Max, it hissed. Embrace the truth, or let it consume you. My hands found a shard of broken metal on the floor, a piece of one of the tendrils, slick with the dark fluid. I gripped it tightly, the edge biting into my palm. The structure writhed violently, as if sensing my intent. I'm not part of this, I said, my voice steady despite the terror in my chest. Not anymore. With a surge of strength I didn't know I had, I drove the shard into the base of the structure. The moment the metal pierced its surface, the entire room convulsed, the walls trembling as the heartbeat faltered. The shadow screamed, a sound that tore through me like a blade. The tendrils writhed and lashed out, but their movements grew weaker, slower. The grotesque mass shuddered, dark fluid spilling from its core. You'll regret this, the shadow snarled, its form dissolving into smoke. You'll never escape. The walls cracked, light pouring through the fissures as the structure collapsed inward. My double's voice reached me one last time, faint but certain. Thank you. And then everything went white. Silence. After the deafening roar of the collapsing structure, the absence of sound was unnerving. I floated in the void, weightless and directionless. The oppressive cold of the hospital was gone, replaced by a sterile, suffocating stillness. The light around me was blinding, a pure white that stretched endlessly in every direction. For a moment, I thought I was dead. Then, faintly, a voice broke through the silence. A whisper. My name. Max. I turned, or maybe I didn't. In the void, movement felt meaningless. The voice grew louder, closer, until it was all around me, pressing against my skin like a heavy fog. Do you remember now? The question echoed, pulling at the fragmented pieces of my mind. I closed my eyes, the light still searing through my lids, and let the memories come. I was in the hospital, but it wasn't the same. The walls were clean, the hallways bright and orderly. Nurses bustled about, their faces kind and familiar. I was just a child, no older than 7, sitting on the edge of a cot while a doctor crouched in front of me. Do you know why you're here, Max? He asked, his voice soft but probing. I shook my head, my small hands gripping the edge of the cot tightly. I remembered feeling scared, though I didn't know why. The doctor smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. You're special, he said, his words eerily similar to what the nurse had said in the hallway. You can help us do something very important. I wanted to ask what he meant, but the words caught in my throat. Behind him, the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and shift, their shapes flickering in the corners of my vision. The memory faded, replaced by another. I was older now, a teenager, walking the hospital's hallways alone. The walls were different, cracked, pulsing, dark veins running along their surfaces. I carried the visitor log in my hands, the leather worn smooth from years of use. The pages were filled with names, but none of them made sense. The whispers started then, faint and distant, but unmistakable. They called my name, drawing me deeper into the maze-like corridors. I didn't question where I was going or why. I just walked, the log growing heavier with each step. When I reached the end of the hallway, I saw it for the first time. The structure, the heart of the hospital. It pulsed faintly, the tendrils twitching as if aware of my presence. I stepped closer, compelled by something I couldn't understand. Max, a voice had said, low and resonant. You are part of this. The memory shattered, plunging me back into the white void. The voice returned, cutting through the silence. You've been here before, it said, its tone neither cruel nor kind. You've seen the truth. What truth? I demanded, my voice trembling. What did you do to me? The light around me dimmed slightly, the void taking on faint shapes, flickering images of the hospital, of faces both familiar and strange. The voice spoke again, calm and unyielding. The hospital is alive, Max. It has always been alive. It feeds on what is forgotten, what is erased. And you... I felt something cold curl around my ankle, pulling me downward. I struggled, but the void offered no resistance, no solid ground to push against. You are its greatest creation. The light dimmed further, and I found myself standing in a room I recognized instantly. The walls were dark and slick, the air thick with the metallic tang of blood. In the center of the room was the chair, now empty, its straps hanging loosely. The grotesque structure was gone, but its presence lingered, a palpable weight pressing down on me. The shadow was there, smaller now, its form flickering weakly. You think you've won, it said, its voice strained. But you can never leave. I destroyed it, I said, my voice firmer than I felt. It's over. The shadow laughed, a dry, rasping sound. You destroyed nothing. You are still here, aren't you? I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The walls pulsed faintly, the veins beneath their surface sluggish but alive. The hospital wasn't dead. It was merely weakened, waiting. You belong to it, the shadow said, its form dissolving into smoke. And it belongs to you. The room began to blur, the walls melting into darkness. I stumbled forward, my hands grasping for something, anything, to hold on to. My fingers found the edge of the chair, the leather straps cold and slick with something wet. And then, faintly, I heard it again, the heartbeat. Slow, steady, growing louder with each passing second. No, I whispered, shaking my head. No, this isn't real. The walls closed in, the sound of the heartbeat deafening now. The shadows crept back, swirling around me, and I realized with a sinking dread that I hadn't escaped at all. The hospital was still alive, and so was I, but not for long. The shadows enveloped me, cold and suffocating, and the pounding heartbeat reverberated through my chest like a death knell. I stumbled forward, clutching my head as whispers clawed at the edges of my mind. Max, they hissed, overlapping and echoing endlessly. You've always been here. You've never left.
No.
I screamed, my voice breaking. I destroyed it. I ended this. But even as I shouted, I could feel the truth seeping into my bones. The hospital wasn't gone. It wasn't over. It never would be. The room around me shifted again, the shadows peeling away to reveal a familiar hallway. The walls were pristine once more, the tiles gleaming under bright fluorescent lights. It was the hospital as I'd first seen it when I was admitted. Normal, clean, deceptive. I staggered forward, my legs weak and unsteady. The sound of the heartbeat faded into the background, replaced by the faint hum of the lights and the soft murmur of distant voices. For a fleeting moment, I thought maybe I'd imagined it all. The shadow, the structure, the pulsing walls. Maybe it was just a delusion, a cruel trick of my broken mind. Then I saw her. Nurse Deborah stood at the far end of the hallway, her back to me. She was speaking softly to someone I couldn't see, her posture rigid. I called out to her, my voice shaky. Deborah. She turned slowly, and the look on her face stopped me cold. Her expression was blank, her eyes dark and hollow. There was no recognition in her gaze, no trace of the concern she'd shown before. Max, she said, her voice flat and monotone. You're not supposed to be here. What do you mean? I asked, my voice trembling. I'm trying to leave. I need to get out. Her head tilted slightly, the motion unnatural. You can't leave. You're part of this place. Her words sent a chill down my spine, and I backed away, my heart racing.
No, iwisparat.
No, I'm not. I don't belong here. She stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate. You've always belonged here, Max. The hospital remembers. I turned and ran, the sterile hallway stretching endlessly before me. Doors lined the walls, each identical, each leading nowhere. My footsteps echoed loudly, drowning out the sound of my own panicked breaths. Behind me, I could hear Deborah's voice, soft but insistent, calling my name.
Max.
Come back. There's nowhere else for you. I didn't stop. Couldn't. The hallways twisted and turned, their geometry impossible, folding in on themselves like the maze I'd tried so desperately to escape before. My surroundings blurred, the walls shifting between pristine white and dark, pulsing veins. At last, I came to a door. It was unmarked, heavy, and slightly ajar. Without hesitation, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was small and empty, save for a single object in the center, the visitor log. The worn leather cover was unmistakable, the edges frayed from years of handling. It sat on a simple wooden table, its presence both familiar and foreboding. I approached it slowly, my hands trembling. The whispers in the air grew louder, urging me forward, their tones both soothing and sinister. "Open it," they said. "You need to see." I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the cover. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and run, but I couldn't. Something deep within me, some buried part of myself, needed to know. With a deep breath, I flipped the cover open. The pages were blank at first, the faint scent of old paper rising from the book. But as I turned them, words began to appear, scrawled in my handwriting. My name filled the pages over and over again, each entry dated at precise intervals. The last date was today. I stared at it, my vision swimming. This wasn't just a record. It was a sentence, a cycle, and I was trapped. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, the walls of the room closing in. The last thing I saw before the light consumed me was my own signature, fresh and final, as though I'd just written it.
Max Whitaker.
The hospital had claimed me, again. When the light faded, I found myself back in my room. The dull hum of the fluorescent light in the hallway buzzed faintly through the closed door, and the sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air. It was as though I had never left. My hands shook as I clutched the edge of the cot, my breath coming in shallow gasps. But something was different. The visitor log was no longer under my mattress. My mind raced, piecing together fragments of what had just happened. The grotesque structure, the whispers, the shadow. Had it all been real, or had I finally succumbed to madness? I stood, my legs unsteady, and moved toward the small window on the far wall. Outside, the world looked normal. The trees swayed gently in the wind, and the sun shone brightly, its warmth filtering through the glass. But the peace was a lie, and I knew it. The hospital had no intention of letting me go. The days passed in a haze. The staff behaved as if nothing was wrong, as if I hadn't torn through the hallways, screaming for answers. Deborah avoided my gaze during her rounds, her polite smile masking something colder, something calculating. Dr. Lewis called me into his office twice, his questions probing but vague. "How are you feeling, Max?" he asked during one session, his voice soft, his eyes too sharp. I shrugged, staring at the floor.
Fine ilid.
Just tired. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze lingering on me for a moment too long. "It's normal to feel disoriented," he said. "You've been through a lot, but you're making progress." Progress. The word made me want to laugh, or scream. At night, the dreams returned. I stood in the hallways again, the walls shifting and pulsing with a life of their own. The heartbeat was faint now, distant, but it was still there. A reminder that the hospital wasn't done with me. The shadow appeared often, its form flickering at the edges of my vision. Always watching, always waiting. "You'll come back," it whispered one night, its voice brushing against my ear like cold breath. "You always do." I woke in a cold sweat, my chest heaving, my throat raw from a scream I couldn't remember uttering. The fluorescent light outside my room flickered erratically, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure standing just beyond the door. On the 5th day, I found the log again. It was in the cafeteria, exactly where I'd first seen it. The worn leather cover, the frayed edges, it was unmistakable. My hands trembled as I picked it up, flipping it open to the first page. The names were there, just as before, each one carefully dated. But this time, my name wasn't alone. Scattered among the entries were other names, written in the same looping handwriting as mine. Names I didn't recognize, but that felt eerily familiar. Each one was dated 20 years apart, the intervals precise and deliberate. I flipped to the last page, my stomach churning. There, at the bottom, was a new name, Deborah Callahan. The date was tomorrow. I closed the log, my breath shallow, my mind reeling. Was Deborah next? Had she been part of this all along? Or was she just another victim, caught in the hospital's endless cycle? The thought made my skin crawl. But as I stood there, clutching the book, I realized something else. The entries didn't stop with Deborah. There was space for more names, more dates. And I knew, deep down, that mine would be there again. The hospital wasn't done with me. It never would be. The shadow appeared that night, hovering at the foot of my bed, its form darker and more defined than ever. "It's not over," it said, its voice low and resonant. "It will never be over." "What do you want from me?" I whispered, my voice trembling. It leaned closer, its featureless face inches from mine. "To remember," it said, "to obey." And then it was gone, leaving me alone in the suffocating darkness. The next morning, Deborah was gone. No one spoke of her. Her absence was a void, a silence that echoed through the hospital's sterile halls. I returned to the cafeteria, my hands clammy, my heart racing. The visitor log was there, waiting for me, and beneath Deborah's name, written in fresh, familiar handwriting, was my own. Max Whitaker, dated 20 years from now. The hospital had claimed her, and I was next, again. The fresh ink of my name in the visitor log burned into my mind like a brand. It wasn't just the date 20 years from now, it was the certainty of it. The way it stared back at me as though mocking my fleeting hope of escape. The hospital didn't just hold me, it owned me. I was part of it, woven into its fabric, a thread in an endless, malevolent tapestry. I slammed the log shut, the sound echoing unnaturally loud in the empty cafeteria. My breath came in shallow gasps, my pulse hammering in my ears. Around me, the air felt heavier, charged with a palpable energy that pressed against my skin. Deborah was gone, and now her absence felt like a weight in my chest. Had she known this would happen? Had she been trying to warn me all along, hidden behind those carefully neutral smiles? Or had she, like me, been a pawn in a game she never agreed to play? The rest of the day passed in a haze. The staff went about their duties as though nothing had changed, their movements robotic, their faces bland and featureless. The patients muttered and shuffled through the hallways, their words a jumble of nonsense. I couldn't focus on any of it. That night, the dreams returned. This time, I wasn't alone in the hallway. The walls pulsed faintly, their veins sluggish, the heartbeat weak but persistent. The light above me flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist of their own accord. And standing in the distance at the far end of the corridor was Deborah. "Deborah!" I called out, my voice echoing strangely. I ran toward her, but no matter how fast I moved, the distance between us remained the same. She stood still, her posture stiff, her head tilted slightly to the side as though listening for something. "Max," she said, her voice faint and distant. "It's not over. You know that." I stopped, my legs trembling. "What do you mean? What's happening to me? What's happening to you?" She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was colder, hollow. "We're all part of it. The hospital, the cycle. There's no escaping it." "No," I said, shaking my head. "There has to be a way out. I destroyed the heart. I stopped it." Her head tilted further, her eyes glinting in the flickering light. "You didn't destroy anything. You only fed it. Every time you try to escape, you bring yourself closer to it. I staggered back, her words a knife twisting in my gut. What do you mean? You were never meant to leave, Max, she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. You belong here. You've always belonged here. Her face began to change then, her features melting like wax, her skin pulling taut over her skull. Her eyes grew dark and hollow, her mouth stretching into a grotesque, too wide smile. And soon you'll remember why. I turned and ran, the hallway stretching endlessly ahead of me. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices rising into a deafening roar. I woke with a start, my chest heaving, the echo of Deborah's voice ringing in my ears. The room was dark, the faint hum of the fluorescent light outside barely audible. But something was wrong. The visitor log was sitting on my bedside table. I hadn't brought it there. My hands trembled as I reached for it, flipping it open to the last page. My name was still there, fresh and final, the date 20 years away. But now there was something else. A message, scrawled hastily in the margins, the handwriting shaky and frantic. Don't trust the walls. My stomach dropped. The words seemed to vibrate on the page, their meaning sinking into my mind like a stone into dark water. The walls, always shifting, always breathing, always watching. How much of what I'd seen had been real? How much had they shown me? And how much were they hiding? I slammed the log shut and shoved it away, my heart pounding. The air in the room felt heavier now, the walls closer, as though leaning in to listen. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, the staff acted like nothing had changed. They smiled, nodded, offered their usual empty reassurances. But I could feel the difference. The hospital was alive in a way it hadn't been before, its pulse stronger, its whispers louder. And as I walked through the hallways, I saw them. The names, carved into the walls, faint but unmistakable, running like veins along every surface. Hundreds of them, overlapping, twisting together into an illegible mass. But one name stood out, clear and deliberate.
Max Whitaker.
The walls were remembering, and so was I. The names stretched endlessly, twisting across the walls like veins beneath pale, translucent skin. Hundreds, no thousands, etched in looping, jagged script. Some were faint, their edges worn and indistinct. Others were fresh, their lines sharp and precise. And then, over and over, standing out against the chaotic web of letters, was mine, Max Whitaker. The walls seemed to pulse as I stared, the rhythm faint but unmistakable. The same heartbeat I had heard in the darkest parts of the hospital. The same beat that seemed to synchronize with my own, pulling me deeper into the endless spiral. Max! A voice hissed from behind me. I spun, my breath caught in my throat. The hallway was empty, but the whisper lingered, brushing against my ears like cold fingers. The air grew heavier, charged with something unseen but tangible. I turned back to the wall, running my fingers over the carvings. The texture was rough, almost organic, and the faint warmth beneath my touch sent a shiver down my spine. Max, this time, the voice was louder, closer. My heart raced as I stepped back, my eyes darting to the corners of the hallway. The light flickered, the shadows stretching unnaturally, their shapes twisting into impossible forms. You need to stop, the voice said, echoing from everywhere and nowhere. You're waking it. What? I whispered, my voice trembling. What am I waking? The walls seemed to breathe, their surfaces rippling like water. The heartbeat grew louder, filling the air with its oppressive rhythm. The names on the walls began to shift, their lines bleeding into one another, the shapes transforming into something unreadable. You're part of it, the voice said, now impossibly close. And it's part of you. I stumbled back, my mind racing. The hallway twisted around me, the walls bending inward, narrowing until they felt impossibly close. The names blurred, their edges smearing like ink under water. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I tried to ground myself, but the world around me refused to stay still. And then I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, where the light faded into shadow, something moved. A figure, tall and thin, its form flickering like a dying flame. It stepped closer, each movement slow and deliberate, its outline rippling with the same unnatural energy as the walls. "Who are you?" I shouted, the words catching in my throat. "What do you want from me?" The figure stopped, its featureless face tilting slightly to one side. When it spoke, its voice was a low, resonant hum, vibrating through the walls and into my chest. "I am the hospital," it said, "and you are mine." The words hit me like a physical blow, the weight of them pressing me to the floor. The walls closed in, the veins pulsing violently, their rhythm chaotic and erratic. The names began to glow faintly, their light bleeding into the hallway, casting everything in an eerie, otherworldly glow. "You belong to me," the figure continued, its voice filling the space, drowning out my thoughts. "You always have."
No.
I shouted, forcing myself to stand. "You're lying. I don't belong here." The figure stepped closer, its form towering over me, its edges flickering like fire. "You've been here before," it said. "You'll be here again. The cycle cannot be broken." The walls began to shake, the floor beneath me trembling as the heartbeat reached a deafening crescendo. My vision blurred, the world around me twisting into a kaleidoscope of light and shadow. "Remember, Max," the figure said, its voice cutting through the chaos. "Remember who you are." The memories hit me like a tidal wave. I was a child again, standing in the middle of the hospital's labyrinthine halls. The visitor log was in my hands, its pages filled with names I couldn't read, the ink smudged and bleeding. The whispers surrounded me, soft and insistent, calling my name over and over. I saw the chair, its straps slick with blood. I saw the structure, its tendrils reaching for me, pulling me into its core. I saw my own face reflected in the mirror-like surface of the walls, distorted and unrecognizable. And then I saw the shadow, the figure that had haunted my dreams, its form merging with the hospital, becoming one with the walls, the heartbeat, the names. It wasn't just part of the hospital. It was the hospital, and so was I. I snapped back to reality, the hallway around me still trembling, the names on the walls glowing brighter. The figure was gone, but its presence lingered, heavy and suffocating. The walls began to close in, the space shrinking around me. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a deafening roar. I dropped to my knees, clutching my head as the chaos consumed me. And then, as suddenly as it began, everything went silent. The hallway was empty. The walls were blank, but the heartbeat remained. The silence pressed against me, suffocating in its totality. The walls, once alive with veins of light and carved names, were now smooth and pristine, devoid of any sign of the horrors I had witnessed. But the heartbeat persisted, a slow, deliberate thrum that resonated in my chest, as though it had been stitched into my very being. I stood shakily, my legs trembling beneath me. The hallway stretched endlessly ahead, its fluorescent light steady and unbroken. For the first time in what felt like hours or days, there were no shadows lurking in the corners, no whispers scratching at the edges of my mind. But I wasn't free. The realization hit me like a blade to the gut. The walls, though blank, were watching. I could feel their gaze, heavy and unrelenting. I could feel the weight of the hospital around me, not as a place but as a presence, an entity. And within that presence, I felt something else. Me. I stumbled forward, unsure of where I was going or why. The air felt thick, every breath a struggle. My hands trailed along the walls as I walked, their surfaces cold and unervingly smooth. The heartbeat grew louder, the rhythm steady and unyielding, guiding me deeper into the labyrinthine corridors. "Max," the voice came from nowhere and everywhere, soft but commanding. I froze, my heart pounding in time with the hospital's pulse. The walls around me shimmered faintly, their surfaces rippling like water. "You are ready," the voice said, calm and resolute. "It is time." "Time for what?" I demanded, my voice cracking. "What do you want from me?" The walls didn't answer, but the hallway began to shift. The smooth surfaces rippled and stretched, the light dimming until I was bathed in a faint, flickering glow. Ahead of me, a door appeared. Simple, unmarked, and impossibly familiar. I knew what was behind it. I didn't want to go, but the hospital wouldn't let me stop. The door swung open as I approached, revealing the room I had tried so desperately to escape. The chair stood at the center, its leather straps hanging limply, the air around it charged with an electric hum. The walls were dark, pulsing faintly with the same rhythm that now echoed in my chest. I stepped inside, my movements slow and reluctant. The door closed behind me with a soft click, sealing me in. The chair seemed to call to me, its presence magnetic, irresistible. "Sit," the voice commanded. I shook my head, my fists clenching at my sides. "No," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm not doing this. I'm not part of this." "You have always been part of this," the voice replied, unyielding. "You cannot escape what you are." The walls began to pulse more violently, the veins beneath their surface glowing with a dark, crimson light. The air grew heavier, pressing against me like a physical weight. My legs buckled, and I fell to my knees, gasping for breath. "You are the hospital," the voice said, "and the hospital is you." I crawled toward the chair, my movements sluggish and unwilling. The heartbeat thundered in my ears, drowning out my thoughts, my fear, my resistance. The closer I got, the stronger the pull became, until I was gripping the edge of the chair, my body trembling. As I sat, the straps moved on their own, winding around my wrists and ankles with a mechanical precision. The leather was cold against my skin, but I felt no pain, only an overwhelming sense of finality. The room darkened, the walls fading into shadow. The heartbeat slowed, its rhythm deep and resonant, filling the space with its presence. I closed my eyes, the weight of the hospital settling over me like a shroud. And then I understood. The hospital wasn't a place. It was a memory, a collection of souls, a repository of forgotten pain. It had been built not of brick and mortar, but of people like me, who had been consumed by its endless hunger, who had become part of its ever-growing existence. I was no longer Max Whitaker. I was no longer anything. I was the hospital. When I opened my eyes, I was everywhere. I felt the walls pulse with life, the hallways shift and stretch, the shadows whisper their secrets. I was in every crack and every crevice, in every soundless scream and every unspoken thought. And somewhere, deep within the endless maze of corridors, a new name appeared in the visitor log. A new patient, lost and scared, clutching a memory they couldn't quite grasp. They would join me soon enough. The hospital never forgets. Thank you for listening to my story. Like it if you liked it, and write in the comments if it was creepy or not.